Good afternoon, Europe, and good morning, North America. I'm Roger Hilton, and welcome to this afternoon episode of Global Tremors. It has been a week since Russia invaded Ukraine, with no immediate end to the conflict in sight. Joining us from Budapest is András Radnóti, managing partner at Millennium Emerging Europe, who will give his reaction to day 7 of the war, the ongoing domestic situation in Ukraine, and will provide the implications of the geopolitical ramifications of the invasion as they relate to Central and Eastern Europe, the EU, and other geopolitical hotspots. András, thank you so much for joining Global Tremors.
Thanks for the invitation, and hi, everyone.
Yeah, so everybody, is our normal modus operandi here. We're going to go through a couple of news highlights since our last interview. So some very sad news to report. Marina Faina, a national member of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, died yesterday in Kharkiv due to shelling. The United General Assembly on Wednesday overwhelmingly voted to reprimand Russia, with only 4 countries voting against the resolution: Russia, Belarus, Eritrea, North Korea, and Syria, so 5 in total, and 35 members, including China, abstained. According to the Slovene MFA, after Russia's military assault on Kharkiv, the Slovenian consulate was destroyed. There are 39 states referring the situation in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court, which for all of our views represents the largest referral in the history of the ICC. When it comes to Russia, the editor-in-chief of RT's Russian language cover, Maria Baronova, has resigned from the outlet. And in an interesting turn of events, the German government has seized Russian billionaire Alisher Umanov's mega yacht, the 512-foot Dilbar, valued at nearly 600 million. So András, before we get into the main questions, what's your reaction to the UNGA vote right now?
Yeah, so it demonstrates the fact of Russia's isolation, right? So only 4 countries other than Russia voted against the resolution. About 35 others, if I'm not mistaken, have abstained. The 4 countries that voted against it were Belarus, Eritrea, North Korea, and Syria. So that means that even some of Russia's staunch historical allies, such as Serbia, didn't support it. So that's pretty striking. That's pretty striking. That shows an astonishing sort of unity in the global community in condemning this war.
András, for everybody watching, do you think it's more telling that there was only 4 countries that voted against it, or, like as you said, you had countries like Serbia and as well as China who abstained from it? I mean, obviously, President Putin predicated a lot of this invasion on having some strong diplomatic outlets, and maybe it is quite telling that China chose to abstain as opposed to standing with Russia and rejecting the resolution.
Yeah, so I think it's important not to overstate the unity of the global community. There is unity. Certainly, as I said, it's striking that only 4 countries voted with Russia, but there's also a lot of balancing going on, right? Especially in East and Southeast Asia, China, India, and various Southeast Asian countries hedging their bets in the conflict, making. Yeah, in their comments about the conflict, they stress the need for peace and urge both parties to de-escalate. So essentially, make non-committal comments.
Well, everybody joining on Global Tremors, we're speaking with András Radnóti, thematic expert, private consultant. So András, let's get right into sort of the meat of our discussion today. It's been a week and it seems like forever. So much has changed throughout the world. What is your reaction of day 7? What has stood out for you the most? What has surprised you? What are the big disappointments?
So look, despite apparently taking the city of Kherson in the south, which is sort of the first major settlement that Russia has captured, and it's not entirely clear that it's captured it. So we know that from a series of tweets from the mayor of the city, but there are conflicting reports. But it appears that Kherson has been taken. Despite that, the lack of successes of the Russian military remain striking. And what that means is that the core outlook remains further escalation and potentially uncontrolled escalation. Facing setbacks, Putin is opting and will opt to escalate the conflict and further. That is what's already seen massive and indiscriminate shelling, missile and air attacks in Kyiv and Kharkiv. And the core outlook for these is to continue throughout the day and then throughout the night and tomorrow, even as the second round of talks is due to begin on the Belarusian border. And what they'll be followed by, presumably, is block to block, street to street fighting, first in Kharkiv and then in Kyiv. So we've already seen some of that in Kharkiv. That's obviously indicative of what's coming in Kyiv. That is what everyone is sort of assuming is the purpose of this large military column lined up outside of Kyiv. And given the fact that Russia uses Grad missiles and other indiscriminate weapons, this is very likely to lead to a further heavy spike in civilian casualties, the beginning of which has been visible in Kharkiv in the past couple of days.
Sorry, András, let me just get back to you because you mentioned the word victims and casualties. So for everybody watching right now, András has basically said, if I understand, that like most people, a week in, this has really been a military failure. They've only been able to take one city, more or less, as you say. Resilience is high, and your prescription right now from the private sectors as the core outlook is its escalation. Something for me, András, that I want to get your take on is finally a week into the conflict, the Russian MOD finally acknowledged combat deaths. And we've been talking about combat deaths. They had reported somewhere between 500 or 600, which pales in comparison to what the Ukrainian MOD and also the Pentagon is putting at, which is at 6,000, which would be more than the amount of Russian soldiers killed during the two Chechen wars. So while we get to this block-to-block fighting, everybody's been talking about insurgency. Do you still think that Putin cannot return right now and he has to go all in, despite the body bags and the backbreaking economic sanctions that are already crippling and cratering the Russian economy?
Absolutely, because if you back down now, then the offensive itself, all the casualties so far would be impossible to justify for him to his own elite and to his own hinterland, right? So yes, 100%, and that's why I'm saying that the fact of that Ukraine is resisting so bravely, so staunchly, so heavily, the fact that they've achieved some fairly significant successes in fending off the Russian invasion indicates not an ultimate Russian defeat in this war, but that the war will be lengthy. And that the war will lead to a lot of casualties, a lot more potentially, unfortunately, than including civilian casualties than anyone had imagined before.
András, coming from the private sector, we've heard a lot of thematic experts, peoples of civil society, former NATO officials, but you're in a unique position here on Global Tremors as the first sort of consultant. If we were to do a quick SWOT analysis from Putin's perspective, where if our working theory right now is that this is going to be a protracted conflict, that there's going to be body bags coming back to Russia, the economy is going to be pounding, do you think Putin is actually looking for a diplomatic off-ramp? And if so, the rumors now that he's looking for a negotiated solution, Ukraine conceding Crimea to Russia, and an agreement for Ukraine never to join NATO and the EU and demilitarization. If that's the off-ramp and it's just impossible, how does Putin weigh the pros and cons of both situations?
Well, so what's certain is that there appears to be pressure within Russia on Putin to seek a settlement, that the kind of settlement that you've described. The problem is that that doesn't seem achievable. right? The negotiating positions of the two parties are simply too far removed from one another, right? So Russia wants what? Russia wants demilitarization. It wants the federalization of Ukraine. It wants Ukraine to recognize Crimea, and it wants Ukraine to recognize that the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics within the oblast borders, right? So 3 times the size of the territory that has been controlled by separatists over the past 8 years. That is political suicide for anyone in Ukraine. And because it's kind of difficult to imagine Putin settling for anything less than that, precisely because of what I said, precisely because how does he justify the offensive otherwise? So if there's, a commitment from the West, a commitment from, written commitment perhaps from the Ukrainian government that they won't join NATO, well, I mean, he could have had that without attacking. Right? He could have had that without losing 6,000 people. I mean, we know that although in public, the Ukrainian government has always asked for, or I guess stressed that they're looking for NATO membership. We know that that they would have been open to that kind of settlement before the war. So it doesn't stick together, which is why the core outlook, as I said, remains a spike in casualties and a push further into probably Western Ukraine once Kyiv is captured. Because once Kyiv is captured and a proxy government is installed in Kiev, and the current government, or whatever remains of it, goes to Lviv. Well, the situation will not have changed. The negotiating positions are unlikely to have changed. So Putin will likely be left with no option but to push further.
Well, for everybody watching right now on Global Tremors, again, we're getting the private sector view on this. And according to András, from his reading of the diplomatic meetings in Gomel, the two sides are just too far apart, with nobody willing to give any ground. Before we move to the domestic situation, András, where you really excel and you're a champion at, there are rumors on Twitter right now that, the swell of protests in Russia are really growing, and that there's a chance as of tomorrow, President Putin will enact martial law in Russia, which would be a huge domestic escalatory step, and one I don't think he expected to take 8 days into the war. You have Alexei Navalny, who's still in jail, saying that at 2 o'clock people need to go out and protest, and even former Foreign Minister Koryzev, MGIMO alumni, asking for all of the foreign service staff to resign, saying that you're professionals and not actors. So I mean, again, everybody watching, a very bleak assessment from the private sector view. And András, before we got in there, we talked a little bit about Ukraine, and you've been doing a lot of work in Ukraine for the past decade or so. So, what is your impression right now of the domestic situation inside Ukraine, maybe as a Hungarian or as a private sector? Because I mean, I think they have defied all expectations, and, we'd love to get your take on that.
So look, the poll results that have been doing the rounds in the news and on Telegram and Twitter are that Zelensky's approval ratings have tripled, right? So he's on 90% now. That's not very interesting from, I guess, any political scientist's perspective, right? Because it's the obvious reaction of the people to crisis and war, right? To rally behind the incumbent. But I believe it's indicative of a broader strengthening of the sort of consensus around Ukraine's Western geopolitical orientation, right? Something that is essential for its long-term survival, right? So there's a reading on which happens to be my reading, on which Ukraine, I guess modern Ukraine was in a substantial sense born in 2014, right? So Ukraine was very divided along the sort of geopolitical development vector line up to that point. Two things happened, right? One is I guess very practical, very prosaic, which is that with the annexation of Crimea and the establishment of separatist control over the Donbass, about 6 million voters, presumably most of them pro-Russian voters, were taken out of the Ukrainian political equation. So that's one thing. But also, and perhaps more importantly, the rest of the Ukrainian population, the rest of the Ukrainian voters, those who have been undecided on the matter of the country's geopolitical vector, and perhaps those who had been pro-Russian, were given second thought. So what happened is that a pro-Western consensus emerged. For the first time in the history of independent Ukraine since 2015 or somewhere around there, there's been a majority for joining NATO, and that's extremely significant. But it's a fragile majority. What's happening now, if Ukraine survives as a unitary state, is that this consensus will be much stronger. So, I guess Ukraine may have Putin to thank for that if it survives. Interestingly, another battlefront on which has sort of put the brakes on Ukraine's development over the past 30 years or so, is the sort of constant tug of war unfolding in economic and not just economic governance, really, between the oligarchy and the political leadership. What appears to have happened now, and what is little talked about, is that the oligarchs have lined up. The oligarchs have lined up behind Zelensky and behind the defense effort, at the risk that if the Russian invasion succeeds, then they lose a lot of their wealth. That also signals a newfound unity and perhaps a chance for Ukraine, if it survives as a unitary state, to move beyond this issue that has, as I said, put the brakes on its development over the past 3 decades.
András, let me come back to you on one issue right now. You've made this great point for everybody joining that Ukraine essentially from a geopolitical development was only born fairly recently, right? Maybe 10 years ago. Obviously, all of the credit and the approval rating, which you fairly said, is not really indicative with Zelensky being at 90%. But from your take, while Zelensky right now might be getting all of the credit, can you speak maybe a little bit to the reforms or sort of the past administration with Poroshenko? And, did he have a lot to do in sort of getting Ukraine where they are now? Or was this really since Zelensky won the election, it's been, completely his project of reform for the country?
No, I think of it as a continuum since 2014. Also in political terms. So, essentially, what we see over the past year, really since the jailing of Viktor Medvedchuk, a Putin ally and prominent politician and oligarch in Ukraine, who was arrested early last year. So what we've seen since then is Zelensky moving towards the right of the political spectrum, right, moving into the sort of nationalist, staunchly pro-independence position that was previously occupied by Poroshenko, the previous president, and his main political foe. So I think it makes sense to think of it as a continuum. Reforms. I guess you could make the argument that there's been more progress under Zelensky, but most of the progress that's happened under Zelensky on structural reforms took place in the first 6 months of his presidency. Since then, it's been a case of two steps forward, 1 step back, then 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. Pretty much like under Poroshenko, which itself is a little better than what we saw under Yanukovych, than what we saw under Kuchma before. But there's a prominent journalist in Ukraine, the editor-in-chief of the magazine Zerkalo Nedeli, called Yulia Mostova, who once said that Ukraine's favorite sport is promising everything and delivering nothing. That has held throughout the past 8 years, despite the material progress that we've seen. Obviously, that progress lagged far behind the demands of Ukraine's Western partners.
Yeah, András, throughout this series of global tremors, we've spoken from, civil society members in Odessa and Kharkiv and across Ukraine. And I think they're more or less in agreement with you that sort of the reform has been a continual progress. There hasn't been one guy who has come in and made a huge transformation. Some areas have gotten better than others. It's still up for debate on how effective the de-oligarchization laws have been, the judicial reform. But if there's one thing that somebody can take credit for, is sort of the reform of the military, at least, where now they've really learned their lesson from 2014, and whatever the figures are, 400,000 battle-hardened Ukrainians, the civil service, national defense. So I mean, in one sense, obviously they've had to prioritize what to reform, but that's the private sector view on it. That's great. András, we're moving to the last part of our interview right now, and we want to get to sort of the big geopolitical implications of what's happened. We spoke a little bit before we got on air, and obviously what is going on in Ukraine is not confined or an isolated event that will stay bilateral between Ukraine and Russia. So, András, you're sitting in Budapest. Do you want to start off by giving us what you take, or what's your assessment of the implications on a regional, Central and Eastern Europe review? We'll go to Europe, and then we'll take some of the more global issues.
Yeah, so interestingly, there have been fears, and perhaps marginal fears, really, that once Putin establishes control over the whole of Ukraine, he won't stop there. He'll go further, right? So there was this viral video of a Russian soldier uncovering alleged plans to move further into Moldova. There are obviously widespread fears of in Lithuania that Putin will next move to create a land corridor to the Kaliningrad exclave. So there are those fears that, from where I sit, appear marginal, right? I mean, even the governments of Moldova and Lithuania, respectively, don't really give it too much credit, right? Because people, I guess, understand that Ukraine's neutrality, at least, is whether that's justified or not, it's a number-one strategic priority for the Russian elite, and has been since forever. And that's geography. But that the same isn't true of Lithuania or Moldova. But still, interestingly, the market appears to have priced that in. So apart from also, I guess, the relatively large exposure of Central and Eastern European banking sectors to Russia and Ukraine, and the relatively large exposure to potential fallout from on energy imports. So, which is why the all of the region's currencies, save Romania, have taken a big hit along with the ruble and the hryvnia. Romania hasn't, largely because its banking sector isn't as exposed to either Russia or Ukraine as those of Hungary and Poland, for example, the Czech Republic, and because it is less dependent on gas imports as well, because of its relatively large domestic production capacity. Politically, it's Hungary that stands out. Hungary, which I guess much of the international press expected to throw a spanner in the works of a united Western or a united EU response, but it didn't. I think it's important, again, not to overstate Orban's U-turn on this. I don't think there's been a U-turn. I think it's always been a balancing game. It's always been a balancing game, largely driven by the overlapping interests of Orban and Putin on the one hand, and Hungary's dependence on the EU and on the United States on the other. So it's always been a balancing game, and I think it continues a balancing game. Orban is pursuing a doublespeak where he, in his communication, again, like much of Southeast Asia, he stresses the need for peace, right? Which to Ukrainian ears isn't that promising, because the question arises, at what cost is the price for peace Ukraine's statehood? Because then perhaps that's a deal that many Ukrainians wouldn't want to make. With or to give you another example, with So he, signed up to to Russia's exclusion from the SWIFT system. He signed up to all of the EU sanctions, followed the EU line, but he forbade lethal weapons passing through Hungary's territory on their way to Ukraine.
András, let me just stop. I mean, I'm so happy you brought that up, actually, that you sort of, for everybody joining us again, András, who's based in Budapest, you're telling everybody right now that Orban has really done a really complete 180 on it. And just something, András, that I want everybody to know, to put it in context for you, is that also don't forget that President Orban visited Russia maybe a week or 10 days before the invasion started. Putin had said publicly that there would be no gas interruptions to Hungary, which, if I'm correct, makes Russian gas to Ukraine to Hungary is about 80%. But it's really interesting from your perspective, and also shocking, as you said, that Hungary signed up for the SWIFT ban, but on the military side, they're not letting any equipment or lethal aid transit through the government. So
what I'm saying isn't that it's a 180. It isn't a 180. It's a continuation of the balancing act.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, so I mean, thank you for clarifying that on that. András, we started in CEE, and maybe it could be argued that there are some big ramifications coming out of it. What is your reading of the situation in the EU? I mean, obviously Germany has gotten a huge amount of attention. The EU's policy. Is there anything major on the EU level that you think, from a private sector, you want to communicate to our viewers?
Yeah. So look, the West response has been a lot stronger and much more united than anticipated by anyone, much more capable of achieving the effective isolation of Russia. Still, obviously, not enough to give Putin second thought. So it has been astonishingly united, right? I mean, dilemmas that have sort of paralyzed movement within the EU for decades, such as over Germany's position on arms exports, have been resolved in the matter of a weekend, really. Such as over Nord Stream 2, and so on and so forth. This is likely to continue, right? The West is likely to hold together. So we now obviously expect the EU to grant candidate status to Ukraine, which is again a huge symbolic step. I mean, Ukraine's main problem with Ukraine's main complaint against the EU has been, for the past decade or so, that there's no, not even a long-term perspective of Ukrainian membership in the EU. That again has been resolved in literally in the matter of a weekend. Further sanctions are likely. Ultimately, all investment flows between Europe and Russia will grind to a halt. But what the Ukrainians really want, and what would really change the balance of power on the ground in Ukraine, would be a no-fly zone, and that we believe is likely to be the first thing that Ukraine really wants and does not achieve with this conflict. Most of the things they've really wanted, they've achieved. This they won't achieve, because it would mean a direct war between the NATO and Russia.
Yeah, I mean, András, obviously, and thank you for your analysis on sort of your idea that, the West has proven much more effective and capable of keeping unity together. And when it comes to the no-fly zone, I mean, we spoke about this yesterday. It was one of the main talking points for President Zelensky speaking in his bunker to CNN. Like you said, a no-fly zone isn't something you set up. It's something that you have to enforce, and it would bring, American or NATO jets into direct contact. Right now, at least, there's conversations, I don't know with Russia, but the idea about a partial no-fly zone over a lot of the nuclear facilities in Ukraine, because obviously, this is a very dangerous situation. András, we have maybe 2 or 3 minutes left, so I want to move out of Europe, and I want to talk about the big elephant in the room when it comes to China and Taiwan. Former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said Sunday that it is time for the US to make clear that it would defend Taiwan from a Chinese invasion and ditch its longstanding strategic ambiguity. András, obviously Beijing is watching very clearly. We've already referenced how they've abstained from the vote. What's your reading on, Beijing? Do you think that they've been surprised as well at the unity that's, put forward? And do you think maybe this has changed their calculus one way or another with Xi Jinping in regards to sort of Taiwan?
That they've been surprised on about what?
Sort of the unity, the heaviness of the sanctions, and sort of the commitment to it, right? I mean, like, as you said, over a weekend, Germany's completely switched its policy on sending arms, and they've canceled Nord Stream 2. So, I mean, what are the lessons learned for Beijing from the West, and how does it impact their future policy towards Taiwan?
I think that largely depends on the outcome, right? It largely depends on how the war ends. And like I said at the beginning, it's hard to see any outcome that doesn't involve a lot more blood and likely the eventual an eventual Russian victory of some sort, because otherwise Putin simply can't back down. He can't stop unless he's able to justify the offensive to his own hinterland. So the West, I think the reason for the West's astonishing unity on this matter is that there's it's being increasingly recognized as a sort of watershed moment in global politics, right? The official end of the rules-based international order, so to speak, that everyone has sort of expected to be nearing its end anyway because of Russia's belligerence, because of China's belligerence, and so on and so forth. But the recognition that this is perhaps officially the end of it, the line. And I agree. If this succeeds, if the borders of Ukraine are rewritten, if Ukraine is carved up into several dysfunctional smaller statelets, then all bets are off regarding China's territorial claims as well. So yes, the entirety of the Washington foreign policy establishment is rightly worried that if Putin gets Ukraine, then that will embolden China regarding Taiwan. That's very clear.
Well, András, we're about to sign off now. So for everybody on Global Tremors, what is your sort of last core outlook, or what is your last assessment that we should all be, standing for a week on into this war and looking forward?
I believe there's no good news. Control over the whole of Ukraine remains Putin's key goal, which means that once Kyiv is captured, something that may take a week, something that may take even longer, and require a lot of casualties, fighting may very well continue in the country's west, potentially lasting several more months. And once the occupation of Ukraine is a fact, a heavily armed insurgency is very likely to begin, drawing out this conflict into the long term.
Yeah. Well, for everybody watching, thank you so much, András. Thank you for coming on and giving this private sector tech your assessment. It's been, enlightening on my end. So for all of our viewers on Global Tremors, we might be back later today around 5. But again, András, have a great day. Thank you very much. Slava Ukraina, and stay tuned, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.